Well, I think we're going to start now. So welcome everybody. I think there are a few more people to join us, but they'll join as we begin. Thank you for joining us this evening to this session from which is going to be led by Les Huckfield, called "If You Work It, You Should Control It," about worker co-ops in the UK from the 1970s to the current day. And I am chair of Cooperatives West Midlands, and I'm delighted that we've been able to host this today. Just a few sort of housekeeping points. We are, as I think you all already know, recording this. So if you obviously turn off your camera if you don't want to be seen. Can you make sure that if you're not contributing, your microphones are turned off? Please do contribute via the chat. Phil will be sort of monitoring it as we're going along and hopefully being able to capture any salient points. We will take questions and contributions after Les's presentation. So you know, do hold on and be ready for that point. And just to say that we will share the presentation and the chat so that everything in there is also sent to you after the event. So on that, I'm delighted to welcome Les. Some of you may already know him, but he has a fairly distinguished career in the cooperative movement. He's been an MP, an MEP. He was a Labour government minister and was on the Labour Party NEC, where he represented cooperative political committees when there was that direct affiliation to the Labour Party. More recently, he was a contributor to the Labour Party Alternative Models of Ownership report, which was commissioned in 2017 by John McDonnell and Rebecca Long-Bailey. And then from 2017 to 2019, he was a member of the John McDonnell's implementation group for how you interpreted the Labour Party policy to doubling the size of the cooperative sector. In November 2021, his book, How Blair Killed Co-ops, was published by the Manchester University Press. And in it, he talks about how in New Labour, there was a shift away from cooperatives, mutuals, and democratically accountable structures towards individually controlled enterprises such as community interest companies. So as I pointed out to Les before we started, on the publicity for tonight's event, it said Les will entertain and inform us about the history of worker co-ops from the 1970s to today. So I think we all await to be entertained. And at that point, Les, over to you.
Right, okay. First of all, good evening to you all. Can you all see me and hear me? Well, that's a pretty good start. I have to say that Joe only mentioned the entertain bit tonight, so I might have to change my lines a bit. Seriously, nice to see you all. I mean, there's some good friends and some old friends from various parts of the country. Good to see Richard again down in Frome, and also to see Louise in Glasgow. Who's obviously got a team with her, so I'm very impressed indeed. No, seriously, nice to see you all. Before I start the presentation, I just want to say this, to be very candid with you. Very grateful to Phil and Joe for doing a lot of the background organising for this, and for Louise and others who've also helped with bringing in additional people. So thank you very much indeed. Before we start, the other point I want to make is that I'm not going to say that I know it all. I really don't. Like most of you, I'm a cooperator. I suppose the one slight advantage that I've got is that I've probably been doing it for a bit longer than some of you watching tonight. I don't conceal the fact to my students that I come from a different generation. So if I'm able to speak with a bit of experience, that's what I want to try and share with you tonight. It's not that I know it all, it's that I can't, because I've actually been doing it for quite a long time. Okay, let me get straight away into the presentation. I hope this works. We did a bit of a trial before we started, so let me just share my screen. And again, if people can't see this properly, then the sooner you can tell us, the better, because if you can't see it, we should be wasting our time. Okay, now, for those of you that I can still see, can everybody see that okay? Right, Joe can see it. Can you see Louise? Right, okay, John can see it. Okay, right, Phil can see it, hopefully. Let me get straight into the presentation and just a bit of background, first of all. I think that it's not really generally appreciated in terms of how policy is made, that you really do need to do a lot of preparation before. And this is a theme that I'm going to repeat quite a lot of my presentation tonight. A lot of people seem to think that Thatcher, for instance, introduced monetarism. That's not the case. Monetarism had been introduced in the 1960s in the Financial Times, The Economist. There was some Bank of England reports. There was particularly the Dennis Healey 1976 IMF loan. So a lot of the ground had been prepared. And one of the things that we're still not doing as a wider co-op movement is learning from that lesson of having to do the preparation beforehand. I suppose one of the reasons for the downfall of Liz Truss, and I have to say I've never been particularly a fan of Liz Truss, is that the ground hadn't been prepared. So a lot of the Truss Kwarteng stuff took people a lot by surprise. Though we've got to do the preparation, I don't want tonight to be a sort of all our yesterdays. I think there's a lot of learning that we can do from what happened in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. It's interesting for me, for example, that a lot of the community wealth building stuff that we're talking about now, that was about in the 1980s as well. But what has changed, and I'm going to be quite blunt about this, is the composition of the political class. This is the big difference that we've got now, and in many ways, I think it may be holding us back. When I first got elected for Nuneaton in 1967, you had to have a labour movement background or you had to have a trade union background. That doesn't tend to be the case nowadays. A lot of people are becoming councillors, a lot of people are becoming MSPs, members of parliament, and they don't have a particularly lengthy or detailed political background, which means that, to be very frank with you, they tend to treat cooperatives and third sector social enterprises, stuff like that, much more from an academic point of view. And I think, quite honestly, that's what a lot of us are suffering from, and I shall be emphasising that theme tonight. So it's because there's a different perception, a different political class. That's why I think that cooperatives and the third sector really aren't on a mainstream political agenda. I want to try and share with you tonight some of the ways that hopefully we can get it onto a political agenda, because again, one of the disappointing things to me is that the preparation that ought to be being done isn't being done. Let me go back to the main points that we made when I was the chair of the National Executive Committee Working Party on Worker Co-ops in 1980. And I've still got some of the documents in front of me tonight. We were actually quite boldly saying that we wanted to use worker co-ops to provide new jobs for the local unemployed. We wanted to be providing jobs that were likely to be a bit more permanent than some of the jobs that were available elsewhere. But above all, we wanted to provide quality jobs as opposed to some of the less than quality jobs that were certainly being made available in Thatcherite times. Those are three cardinal principles of the kind of reasons that we need to be promoting worker co-ops today. But I'm going to say to you quite honestly, we don't hear that said very often today. But the other thing that the Labour Party said as part of a National Executive Committee statement that was made in the background to our worker co-ops working party report, the Labour Party quite honestly said, and quite bluntly said, for those who oppose co-ops, we don't see co-ops, and this was the Labour Party talking, as a means of undermining the strength of the trade union movement. Above all, we see cooperatives as against unbridled competition, and against the present day reality of big business domination. Again, the reason I'm saying that tonight is that you don't hear that said very often by the co-op movement today. Let me get straight away into some of the figures. The big registrations of not only worker co-ops, but all sorts of other co-ops today started, of course, after the 1976 Industrial Common Ownership Act. I've put the figures on the screen there. I've got another graphic showing the figures for registrations there. You can see that there was a tremendous increase in registrations of co-ops. In fact, it was bigger than it is today throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. And of course, it didn't really tail off until social enterprises became the flavor of the day. And hopefully we can talk a bit more about that during the question time later. But for me, one of the very significant things is that the bulk of those registrations, as you can see from those figures, weren't what we used to call IPS co-ops. They were actually companies limited by guarantee. In other words, the registration of what used to be called co-ops then was very, very similar to a lot of what we might call social enterprises today. I won't go into a big definitional debate now, but for many of us, it isn't whether it's a social enterprise, it isn't whether it's registered as a co-op, it's whether it's democratically controlled, and most important, whether it's accountable to the local community. So again, I won't repeat this too often. I'm not too worried about the governance arrangements as long as democracy and accountability to the local community prevails. That's the most important thing to me. We got as far in the 1980 Working Group on Worker Cooperatives as proposing what was then, I suppose, a bit unusual in the UK. We put forward the first definition of the UK version of the Italian Macora law. In other words, if workers were working for a failing firm or their firm had gone bankrupt, there ought to be funding, there ought to be support, there ought to be the availability of a lot of advice and training, etc., for them to set up a workers' cooperative. That was what we proposed in 1980. I'm very pleased to see that there is a bill going to be introduced by Richard Leonard in the Scottish Parliament, hopefully in the very near future, to do that again. So Macora law, the UK version of the Italian variant, wasn't a recent invention. It was something that we put forward, as I say, as a result of that working party 50 years ago. But again, let me give you some of the background to what we did and what we recommended. If we go back in 1976 to the Industrial Common Ownership Act, first of all, that provided a definition of common ownership, because prior to that, most cooperatives were simply registering as private companies. The ICOM Act put some funding into the Industrial Common Ownership movement, ICOM. It made more availability of funding under the Industrial Common Ownership Finance Fund. But basically what it did was to underpin a lot of the developments that took place in those local authority registrations under cooperative development agencies that I've just given you. We followed that up, and of course I was a minister on the government front bench while all of this was being introduced. We followed that up in 1978 by the Cooperative Development Agency Act. Okay, nearly £1 million for the promotion of co-ops. Not as many powers as many of us wanted to see, but nevertheless, it was those two pieces of legislation passed in Harold Wilson's Labour government, the ICOM Act in 76, the Cooperative Development Agency Act in 1978, that underpinned and formed the forerunner, if you like, for a lot of the stuff that local authorities picked up later. Again, I'm repeating myself, I know. We did the preparation which was able to be picked up by local authorities and other people later. Okay, I'm going to whiz through this next 2 or 3 slides, because what I'm going to give you is examples of some of the powers that local authorities used to use, some of the funding powers particularly that local authorities used to use in those days in support of their local cooperative development agencies that they then set up. And about 60 local CDAs were set up in the 1980s by local authorities to take the emphasis on cooperatives forward. A lot of legislation was used, but the purpose of the use of most of that legislation was either to provide grants or to provide land or to provide buildings, but most important, is to enhance, it was used to enhance the power of local authorities in local economic development. I have to be blunt with you, you don't see many local authorities doing local economic development nowadays. I suppose the main power that was used by a lot of local authorities were what we used to know as Section 137. And Section 137 of the Local Government Act of 1972 enabled local authorities to use up to a 2p rate to support local economic well-being and development, which a lot of them used then to give grants, to give additional support to cooperatives. They also used the local government superannuation fund. They also made some use of the limited funds which were available under Peter Shaw's Inner Urban Areas Act in 1978. Again, I won't go through all of the examples. You can pick up the links that I've given to the citations that I've given. All of this comes at the end of my presentation. I've given 3 slides of bibliographic references at the end of my slides, by the way, so you can see a lot of the stuff that I'm referring to at the end of my presentation. But again, a bit of the lesson that I want to try and give you tonight about doing the preparation. When we occupied Meriden, and I was one of the people who led the occupation of Meriden Motorcycle Works, a lot of my constituents worked there, my Unite branch secretary worked there. When we occupied Meriden, and when we went to the Labour government in 1974 to try and get some money to support Meriden, we had to use the Tory Industry Act of 1972 because there wasn't any legislation that we could use that then had been passed by the Labour Party. That didn't come into being until the 1975 Industry Act. The 1975 Industry Act not only empowers to put more money into Meriden, it set up the National Enterprise Board. What the National Enterprise Board did was to take stakes, and equity stakes, by the way, in British Leyland, Rolls-Royce, Alfred Herbert, Sinclair's and Ferranti's. But again, the most important thing was that the National Enterprise Board and the Industry Act empowered central government initially to initiate planning agreements with the firms into which they put the money. In other words, the firms were given money in the form of equity stakes and loans, but they had to conform to a planning agreement before they could get the money. So those were powers in the 1975 Industry Act that were later taken up by local authorities. Again, I'm repeating myself. We did the preparation so that local authorities could pick it up later. You can see the examples that I put on the screen. I won't go through all of that because you can have a look at the reference that I've given later. West Midlands County Council, particularly with Jeff Edge, West Yorkshire County Council, Lancashire County Council, because what all of that did was to strengthen the links, not only with the county council and the industries supported through planning agreements, but a lot of those planning agreements also involve the trade unions, also involve local communities. Again, if I may say so, you don't hear much talk about that today. If you have a look at the West Midlands particularly, and I know that we've got a fair number of people from the West Midlands here tonight, the West Midlands Enterprise Board, and again, a lot of this came from Jeff Edge, they very clearly followed the example of the National Enterprise Board in taking equity stakes in particular sectors with which they built up planning agreements. And again, I'm sliding through these fairly swiftly because what the West Midlands Enterprise Board did in conjunction with the Industrial and Commercial Finance Corporation, they actually by 1983 had achieved 14 planning agreements with firms into which they put the money. So again, if you can see what I'm saying, 1975 Industry Act set the precedent. The powers that the National Enterprise Board used set the precedent. Local authorities picked it up and did it. Now, again, if you try to work out why I'm talking about equity stakes and planning agreements, all of these underpinned what local authorities then sought to do with their local cooperative development agencies in promoting worker co-ops and other kinds of co-ops. A different interpretation of all of that was actually taken by Sheffield, because what Sheffield did was actually to put the co-op development unit into the council house. So a very, very central part of what Sheffield did was to promote co-ops actually using the powers of the local authority, using the economic development powers of the local authority, but actually promoted co-ops from within the council house. That was the basis of the Sheffield Co-op Development Unit. And I was actually a director of the Sheffield Co-op Development Unit until the beginning of last year. So it's still there today. It's still being used today. And the powers of the Employment Committee and the powers of the Employment Coordinator, the Sheffield Employment Coordinator description that I've given you is on the screen there. It comes from Alan Cochrane's PhD thesis. And of course, the first Sheffield Employment Coordinator was John Bennington. I think, again, it's important to have a look at John's summary of the way that Sheffield and other local authorities use their powers. They use their powers for job creation and business development. They use their powers for resourcing trade union and community employment initiatives. But above all, again, they use the economic leverage of the local authority to enhance local economic and community development. A few other details. It wasn't just Section 137, pension funds, Industrial and Commercial Finance Corporation. It wasn't just some of the powers that I've just mentioned, obviously backed up by planning agreements. It was European Union funding as well. And the quote that I've given at the top from Heinke Salish, I was in the European Parliament at the time that that report was produced, and Heinke is reporting that the European Commission's local employment initiatives, valuable contribution to combating mass unemployment, 136 new initiatives in London alone, which provided 3,000 jobs. There's some other powers that were used during that period, again, based on what the European Union was then starting to do with European Social Fund and European Regional Development Fund. I've given some examples there below. The Aston Reinvestment Trust 1989, which is still going in a slightly different form. And of course, the Sheffield Co-op Development Group, as I say, that's still going. And there was a lot of other local authority examples, partly funded from the local authorities' use of powers that I've just described, and many of those, as I say, using European Union funding as well. Another summary there of what the GLC was using, because obviously the GLC, being a bigger unit, had got more money to put in. Going to John Bennington's summary again, £8.43 million invested in 116 enterprises, accounting for 2,000 jobs. What the GLC did, even before the Greater London Enterprise Board was set up, was deliberately trying to create an alternative local social economy, largely based on cooperatives. That, of course, was when John McDonnell was the deputy leader of the GLC, when Ken Livingstone was the leader. But all of that was part of a very deliberate policy by the Greater London Council and the Greater London Enterprise Board to create an alternative local social economy, mainly based on worker co-ops. That's an academic contribution, by the way, from Salomon and Anne Hoyer, from two fairly renowned American observers of the voluntary scene. But what they have described there was that all that I've just been talking about chimed with political goals, grassroots mechanisms, left-wing Labour authorities, and most prominent of all, the Greater London Council. So that's an external summary, if you like, from the States of what was then taking place. Taking that a bit further, because I think what was also happening at that time is very interesting. It wasn't just the fact that local authorities were involved. It wasn't just the fact that cooperative development agencies were involved. It was also the fact that you had the industrial common ownership movement underpinning a lot of that. And the big underpinning that ICOM did, and if you go back to the two ICOM annual reports quotes that I've made, basically what ICOM's view was basically this: you're not all easily going to be able to fit into the regulatory structures that we've devised. So anyone interested in non-model rules registration of any type should phone or write to Charlie Cattell at the ICOM central office. In other words, ICOM was deliberately recognizing at that stage that a lot of people wanting to set up some kind of co-op or some kind of third sector structure needed a bit more than hand-holding and a bit more advice. I suppose the most important thing to come from that, of course, is that Charlie Cattell is still doing it. So Charlie's experience is still there. A lot of the ICOM experience, unfortunately, has now been dissipated in various ways. Another underpinning that a lot of people seem to have missed out on is the role of Beechwood College in Leeds. Beechwood College got an unexpected, fairly hefty grant of European Social Fund money in 1968. That led to Freer Spreckley and Jim Brown doing a lot of co-op development courses. So, in other words, for local authorities who hadn't got enough resources in their co-op development agency locally, they could actually send people to Beechwood to get training and to get instruction and to learn how to set up worker co-ops. So, before we fast forward a bit to what's available in the present day, just have an overview of this, if you can, please. What you got was a Labour government starting to do things nationally, and particularly with the predecessor of the Industry Act in 75, the Industrial Common Ownership Act in 1976, the Co-op Development Agency Act of 1978, local authorities picking it up later, using various powers that they got. You've got ICOM in the background, you've got Beechwood College in the background, you've got European Commission, European Social Fund and European Development Fund, all pushing in the same direction. But again, I'm sorry to keep repeating myself, but the preparation was done, local authorities picked it up, and it was all heading in the same direction, based, if I may say so, on a lot of the stuff that we'd said in our National Executive Committee report in 1980. Now, my contention is that a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about now in the 1980s and 1990s is still there. It's still there. The trouble is, it is not being picked up nationally and taken further forward. A lot of the stuff that Joe's doing, a lot of the stuff that Phil is doing, a lot of the stuff that Johnny Garden Farley is doing with Stir to Action, Radical Roots, Barefoot Co-ops, The Hive. I mean, there's a whole lot of examples which are still there, doing some super work on the ground. You've only got to have a look at Lumio, have a look at the Co-op Development Forum on Lumio, and you will see that a lot of the stuff that we tried to do and had taken forward in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, it's still there, but it's not being translated into national action. So just a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. Joe actually put a very interesting piece in the Co-op Development Forum on Lumio a week ago, describing some of the powers which were needed to take worker co-ops forward and co-ops forward by a local authority. Even more interesting, Anna Peachy from Plymouth, under the auspices of the Co-op Council's Innovation Network, produced another report in 2020 describing in great detail some of the powers that co-op development officers needed to acquire and needed to use. It's unfortunate that because Labour is no longer in control of Plymouth, that is not being taken forward in the same way. But what Joe put on Lumio, what Anna put in that report, what a lot of other reports keep saying, show to me quite conclusively that there is some super work still being done on the ground. But I have to say, I really don't see much of that being picked up nationally, so that I'm going to quite candidly say, unfortunately, at the moment, co-ops, co-op development, social enterprises, and generally speaking, the third sector really don't feature on anybody's mainstream political agenda. We can talk about that obviously in question time, obviously later. I've just put a slide up there showing that showing a quote from Charlie Cattell describing the changing times and the change of the emphasis from cooperatives to social enterprises, but it's still the same kind of thing that was being done. Now, let me just say a few quick words about the New Economics Foundation report on behalf of the Co-op Party called Co-ops Unleashed. I'm going to be absolutely candid with you. I'm not fanatically keen on the emphasis that New Economics Foundation placed on making co-ops and making cooperative development much more amenable to the market. I've never seen the role of co-ops, particularly locally controlled and accountable co-ops, as a part of the market, particularly bidding against the private sector to get contracts. I've always seen co-ops and worker co-ops and local accountable co-ops being there to create jobs, being there to create a local social economy that was an alternative to the market, not participating in the market. We can obviously talk about that a bit later, but I think that some of the findings, quite honestly, in that New Economics Foundation report were slightly taking the wrong emphasis. But again, I want to come back to one of the points that a lot of people seem to have missed. That New Economics Foundation report, although it had, for my liking, far too much of a market emphasis, made a lot of recommendations that a lot of people said to me afterwards, well, Les, you know, that's going to take a lot of time to set up. I have to say that is nonsense. That is nonsense. There's only one part of the the New Economics Foundation report's recommendations, and that's the Co-op Development Agency. That would require new legislation. But again, quite honestly, you could pinch what we did in 1978 and change the words a bit, and you could do it all over again. The bulk of the recommendations which were made in that New Economics Foundation report, well, it's 4 years ago now, could easily have been taken up by co-op sponsored MPs and local councillors. And I'm not saying that all of that could have been implemented, but a lot of it could have been tried to be implemented. That's the problem that we've got. A lot of the stuff is there, but nobody, unfortunately, is really trying to take it forward. As I say, one of the problems that we've got, I think, is that there is quite a significant change in the political class, bluntly, not understanding what you need to do. Okay, let me just give you 2 or 3 examples of what I'm talking about. You don't need specific parliamentary bills and specific parliamentary legislation to do things for co-ops. The Financial Conduct Authority was actually set up under a different piece of legislation called the Financial Services and Markets Act of 2000. The Department of Trade and Industry, when they introduced community interest companies, and I'm not a fan of community interest companies, but they introduced that under another piece of legislation, the Audit, Investigations and Community Enterprise Act of 2004. Similarly, when the FCA was given its present powers of registration, which obviously they took away from the Industrial Provident Society, all of that was done under a different piece of legislation, the Cooperative and Community Benefit Societies Act 2014. All I'm simply trying to show you is that you don't need specific discrete pieces of legislation to introduce things to push forward the co-op's agenda. Another example, there's a lot of stuff which has been reported, Hayes, Brown, Murray, Rogers. If you don't know some of these reports, by the way, to which I'm referring, most of them are talking about asset locks, loans, cooperative capital and stuff like that. All of the stuff that I've referred to in the citations is in the bibliographic references at the end. There's a lot of stuff, as I say, which is available, which somebody could pick up and could try to implement under existing bills. And I'll give you 2 or 3 examples of that in just a minute. But for me, understanding the way that the parliamentary process works and understanding the way that policy is made is as important as putting forward some of these proposals. A lot of proposals put forward, including by the New Economics Foundation, but a lot of people really don't seem to understand how you take some of this a bit further forward. Let's just give you, again, 2 or 3 examples. John Monk's Co-op Advantage Commission, 2001. Okay, there was only 1 page on the social economy, but quite honestly, nothing was done with any of the recommendations in parliamentary terms arising from that commission. Again, giving you some kind of an idea of the difficulties that we had even under a Labour government in 2002, when they produced the first definition of social enterprise. It was only the determination, frankly, of Pauline Green that actually kept co-ops in the picture. A lot of co-op MPs, quite honestly, didn't seem to recognise that the initial definition, which had been produced by the Department of Industry, didn't look very favourably on co-ops at all. And again, if you have a look at when community interest companies were introduced in 2004, a lot of co-op MPs didn't seem to do much to resist that, and frankly, it ought to have been resisted. Again, the lesson I keep repeating is that you have to do the preparation, you have to have the draft legislation ready, like ICOM did in 1976, and like we tried to do by putting it in the Labour manifesto in 1983, do the preparation, and then you can take some of the stuff forward. I got a little line at the bottom that you might have noticed, and you might think, what on earth is Les talking about? I tell you, I went along to the Co-op Development Forum in Birmingham in the warehouse, Thursday, the 12th of September, 2019. We were up against the general election in 2019 that we could see coming. I said to people, well, half a minute, what are the stuff that you're talking about? What about the Clause 5 meeting? And a lot of people said, well, Les, what are you talking about? And I said, well, the Clause 5 meeting is where the Labour Party National Executive meets with the Labour Party policy forums to decide what's going to go in the manifesto. Ought you not to be doing something about that? And people said to me, well, Les, you've actually got a point. Now, I have to say, not really very much emerged from that, but the fact that people engaged in co-op development on the ground didn't seem to understand that they ought to be trying to get things in the Labour election manifesto. I have to say that to me, showed that a lot of people really didn't understand how policy is made and didn't understand much about the political process. And that's a pity, because if you have a look at some of the history, it was David Watkins' Private Members Bill that brought about the ICOM Act in 1976. Gareth Thomas had a Private Members Bill in 2002. Mark Todd had a Private Members Bill in 2003. Okay, small steps if you like, but they actually tried to make it work. And Christina Rees had a Private Members Bill, the Mutual Guarantee Society's bill in 2017. Unfortunately, it had to be withdrawn because it didn't get enough support and understanding. But there are some examples of where private members' bills, where co-op MPs have tried to do a bit. But I suppose the latest example, and I still find this, if I may say so, utterly incredible. Mark Hendrick, co-op sponsored MP, comes from Preston, community wealth building. You would have thought that, quite honestly, despite the fact that Mark Hendrick's Private Members Bill does quite a bit on asset locks, does quite a bit to assist co-ops raising further capital, there has hardly been any discussion in the wider co-op movement about what's in that bill at all. There ought to have been a hell of a campaign based on that bill. This is significant. It's a Private Members Bill, quite a few aspects of which are going to be picked up and supported and implemented by the government. I've spoken to a number of colleagues because I've obviously been preparing this presentation, and a lot of people have said to me, well, Les, what's in the bill? I have to say that when you get a very significant Private Members Bill from an MP from Preston, community wealth building, Matthew Brown, and all the usual bits and pieces, when a lot of people don't understand what's in the bill, I have to say I find that very significant. Finally, because I'm going to stop going on, and obviously we need to get into breakout rooms and do some questions. Let me give you a real example of what I'm talking about. There is at the moment a Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Bill, which is going through the House of Commons. It's controversial. I hope that it will regulate the big tech companies. I hope it'll try and sort out Twitter and some of the other stuff which is about. As part of that bill, the Parliamentary Select Committee, which shadows the DCMS, recently, in fact, only in January, received a report saying that local cooperative journalism isn't getting enough support. So the committee, which will be responsible for the partial consideration of that bill, recently received a report saying we need some more funding for co-op supported local newspapers. Now, okay, co-op MP said, well, yeah, that's a serious problem, but this is a bill that's going through the House of Commons. I haven't seen a single amendment or new clause to take that seriously and to say, half a minute, co-op journalism needs a bit of a help. Co-op journalism needs some grants. It would have been dead easy to go to the table office in the House of Commons, or well, there's a number of ways that you can do it, and basically say, we need to try and get something into that bill to help co-ops. Now, quite honestly, you don't very often come across more open goals than that. It's the same with the levelling up funds. Levelling up, and I'll spare you all the details, but the levelling up funds thing is an absolute walking disaster. Ministers are literally making it up as they go along. There's all sorts of procedures that they go levelling up bids have to go through. But once the bids have been through the various processes, it's all given to ministers to be approved on a political basis. Quite honestly, if you can't get co-ops somewhere in some of that, then I have to say, maybe you ought to re-examine your political purpose in being in the House of Commons. It's the same with community energy stuff. If you can't find space in the political process at the moment for advocating feed-in tariffs, and feed-in tariffs obviously are very beneficial to community energy companies, it's also very local authority helpful as well. And similarly with student housing co-ops. The student union in Glasgow University has come to an agreement with the principal, Anton Muscatelli, that they've got to put a cap on student recruitment enrolment for next year because there ain't enough housing available. But nobody is talking about student housing co-ops. It's the same with the Shared Prosperity Fund. It's the same with a lot of the devolution deals which are going through at the moment. If you can't find space in any of that to put an amendment down, which would obviously be beneficial to co-ops, either a new clause or an amendment. Now, that's no guarantee that it's going to be called because the Speaker doesn't call all new clauses or amendments. But the whole purpose of what I'm saying is that once you put an amendment down, you can go to other MPs and you can say, what about supporting it? You can put down an early day motion and you can get people lining up to sign it. There's all sorts of campaigns that you can mount, basing it on the activities that I've just described, which are well known and well rehearsed parts of the parliamentary process. I'll just sum up again, and I've tried to stick to time, Louise, Joe, I've tried to stick to time. I've probably gone about 5 minutes over. The lessons are there. Do the preparation. A lot of the skills are there. A lot of the people are there. A lot of the reports are there. But what you've got to learn to do is to learn from the past about how policy is made. And one of the most important parts of how policy is made is to know how to use the parliamentary process. I have to say, I don't think very many people in the wider cooperative movement infrastructure seem to understand that at all. And I think, to be candid, we're all suffering from it. Thank you very much indeed. That's it,
Thank
Joe.
you.
That's it.
Well done. Thank you for that. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. I've certainly learned a lot listening to that, and it actually gives me hope, which sometimes is often lacking. But I think it's a bit like, how do you eat an elephant, isn't it? Is actually we've kind of got to take it in small bites, and I think being able to see that sort of picture and those opportunities is really, really helpful. I guess now we sort of throw the floor open to all. We're keen for questions, comments, sort of a general discussion at this point. In a few moments, we will go into sort of smaller groups to look at sort of explore how we can get co-ops on the mainstream sort of political agenda more widely. But at this point, it would be really interesting if people have got questions for Les or want to make some sort of comment. I would ask, as Shamshar has just beautifully demonstrated, if you do want to make a contribution, if you could use the raise your hand in the Zoom thing. And I'd ask that, just to make sure there are plenty of us, so that people keep their contributions concise and relevant, so that we all get a chance to join in. And I will say that if people have got things they want to sort of promote or anything like that, if you pop them in the chat, Phil will come up with them at the end and tell everybody about them, but that's just so that we try and keep on track. So Shamshar, over to you.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm very enamored by the Cooperatives and Communities Benefit Societies Act, because I think that it kind of holds promise. And I wanted to ask, what opportunities do you see for the development of community benefit societies in particular, whether they are charitable community benefit societies or just ordinary community benefit societies, for providing, care, because there is a crisis in care in the country. And, what promise do you think that particular piece of legislation holds for that?
The field is wide open. In fact, the community benefit societies are the fastest growing part of the co-op movement.
Yes.
I mean, the problem is, and I'm obviously very grateful to colleagues in the FCA. If you have a look at the number of actual co-ops on the ground, you'll find that although there's something about 9,000 plus on the mutuals register, once you strip out the working people's clubs and the housing associations and all the bigger ones, there's barely 1,500 co-ops. But on top of that, there's a lot of very rapidly growing community benefit societies. The big thing about community benefit societies is that it cuts out the middleman. You can raise your own funds and you don't need to go to the social investment financial intermediaries who will charge 8% and 9% and nonsense like that. So I think, quite honestly...
Yes, my question was targeted more at what kind of parliamentary intervention are possible there.
Well, I wish you could get...
To grow the sector, to make it more fundable, etc.
I wish you could get a few more members of parliament and MSPs to understand what community benefit societies are. That would be quite helpful.
So those guys aren't doing their jobs, really. Okay, thanks.
Well, no, it's not a matter of not doing the jobs. It's the fact that they aren't being held accountable by the co-op movement. I used to be a sponsored member of parliament. I used to be sponsored in the European Parliament and in the House of Commons by Unite. And before I could get onto the Unite parliamentary panel, they interviewed me and asked me what I thought about certain trade union issues. I had to give a regular report to my trade union branch. I had to report back to Unite nationally, and I did that on a regular basis. That was part and parcel of being sponsored. Accountability, it's called. That doesn't happen in the co-op movement.
Okay, thank you. Ian.
Well, thanks, Les, for an inspiring talk and reminding us that, we have agency and there are institutions within the co-op family that are there that should be advocating and challenging, but I don't think they are. I was minded to about our co-op party branch AGM last week, at which, having sat through a whole lot of rather boring elections and random speeches, I said, could we have a report on the co-op movement? And I've got 5 pieces to report. And I was disciplined for disrupting the meeting and overextending the meeting and talking about stuff that wasn't relevant. And so we've got a problem. People have just started to adopt this passive role. They'll take what they can. That's whatever's going from within the co-op movement, they'll take it, but they're not prepared to do anything. And most of all, they don't want to know about it and they don't understand it, as you say. So the question is, how do we, I don't know, the colloquialism is put a rocket up the backside of the co-op movement and the various elected members to animate them?
Well, one of the contributors tonight, I hope, will be Louise, who's in Glasgow now. What Louise has managed to do with the media co-op is against the odds, started to put together a framework, if you like, a network of potential cooperatives. Now, okay, obviously Louise has had to involve Co-op Development Scotland and has had to involve 1 or 2 other agencies which are supposed to be doing it anyway. but what frequently we need is new people seeing it with different eyes, obviously knowing a bit about the technology that you need to spread the gospel. But I still think there are examples of people who want to take up the message and spread the message. And that's why I hope, Joe, you'll give chance to Louise to say a few words.
Louise, do you want to do that now? Put you on the spot. I
I feel a bit put on the spot. I'm actually not in Glasgow. I'm in London, and we've had a recent bereavement, so I'm not actually very on the ball.
I'm sorry,
tonight.
Louise, I'm sorry.
Yes, no, it's all right, but I kind of don't. My thoughts aren't knitting together particularly well. But just to say, I mean, it's interesting what you're saying. I think the thing that's been really distressing in Scotland has been seeing the kind of unraveling of what had been a sort of relatively coherent sector about 18 years ago when we started our workers' co-op. And I think that was largely put down to moving cooperative development into Scottish enterprise. So the kind of standard kind of economic development agency where cooperatives just don't fit at all. And we've just seen a kind of downward movement. I don't think we've particularly got cooperative champions. There's not a framework or any kind of coherence up here. But one of the big inspirations, I think, well, the two things for me is having younger people coming into Media Co-op we're based in Glasgow, and them not having any kind of local cooperative network to plug into at all, like not getting a sense of like who we are in the world and the fact that, you know, we're part of a, you know, global family. And I suppose the thing that it had been on my mind for a while, just feeling quite frustrated about it, and then seeing the rise of, there's lots of support for social enterprise in Scotland, and I've tried to kind of fly the cooperative flag kind of within that. I know Les has been very involved in that as well. But it was really just the initiative with, I see Caleb up there in the corner, but just with the new worker cooperative federations at the worker co-op weekend, just saying, right, you know, mobilization and how do we kind of mobilize worker co-ops? And that made me think, right, let's just start trying to get people together in Scotland. And so it's just starting to do that. And then you start noticing all the gaps, and then you see things, the possibilities opening up, I suppose. And it is just a real frustration. I think it's true. We can get things going at a kind of more at a grassroots level. I mean, lots to do, but it's really just depressing how few people there are lobbying for co-ops. I can't talk about the rest of the UK, just know a bit about Scotland. And I'm not one of the people that does that either, but I'm really aware of the fact that we don't have sort of people championing co-ops in a kind of coherent way. There doesn't seem to be a plan for what we could do to build the cooperative movement in Scotland.
I'm just going to butt in, Joe, because I think that's an answer to what Ian is saying. You see, in Scotland, we've actually got Cooperative Development Scotland, which is part of Scottish Enterprise. We've also got the Co-op Party, which is actually quite active. I mean, I belong to the Co-op Party in Scotland. But as Louise says, despite the fact that you've got all of that on the ground, what Louise has had to do is almost to build up co-ops using the media co-op against the odds. So the answer to Ian is that, yes, there's some structures, but I have to say they're not very active.
Yeah. The problem is you can't have a development agency for cooperatives in somewhere like Scottish Enterprise, where they don't look at it as a holistic thing. They sort of cherry pick. I mean, it's so against everything that cooperatives are about, but it's cherry picking the bits that you think are going to fit in with a sort of very right leaning economic policy, and then leaving everything else on the side of the plate. And it's just not how it works. And it's not about the way that we would all, you know, we see Principle 6 there. So all about just connecting us as a sector, looking at us as a whole. none of that solidarity between different co-ops. That just has been absolutely lacking. There's no encouragement for that. So, you know, I think it's been a colossal failure, Cooperative Development Scotland, unless you're going for the kind of employee-owned things, in which case it's been, you know, but the whatever it is, management, buyout, succession, whatever, you know, that bit's been quite successful. But actual cooperatives, not at all, I think. So
thank you.
The problem that we've got with
that.
Co-op Development Scotland has now become a conversion mechanism for
exactly,
employee ownership.
Exactly, because it fits with the rest of Scottish enterprise.
Well, and unfortunately, Co-ops UK is going the same way, you see. I mean, that's the problem that we've got.
Okay, John, I think you want to come in, maybe on the same point, maybe to build on.
Well, a couple of points. One is just to say, in my day, which is 10 years ago, we had CMS, Corporation Mutuality Scotland, but you allowed that to be whatever. I don't know what happened to it, destroyed or whatever. And yeah, I could fill in a few bits and bobs, but I won't now because I'm another old timer. And Caroline Charlton's just reminded me that she worked at Wumkoff back in the, what would that be, the 80s, Caroline. But actually, I just wanted to support what you were saying, Les, around you know, rolling the pitch, doing your preparation work. And one of the things we could and should be doing now, and if I wasn't here, that's what I would be doing, would be at my local constituency Labour Party, providing our input to the National Policy Forum consultations, which has to be completed by the 17th of March. But I can't be at the meeting that we're having, the all members meeting, because I'm here. And I think that I would like to know, Les, whether you think this is a real opportunity or simple distraction and going through the motions, and actually the Labour Party is going to take absolutely no notice of whatever goes on with this National Policy Forum consultation.
Well,
it does strike me that there might be an opportunity, and that the Co-op Party could be marshalling cooperative forces in order to maximise our input to that process.
Well, John, you've raised a very important point, you see, because what happens in Labour Party policy forums, as you know, is that it's very difficult to amend what they produce. And what they usually produce is a sort of glorified, all-encompassing statement, which is usually not very easy to incorporate in the manifesto. So alongside what the Labour Party policy fora are doing, I think what the Co-op Party ought to be doing, and what obviously other co-op agencies ought to be doing, is to put forward specific proposals like, we want a Macora law, we want proposals for extending industrial democracy, and there's various things that we could talk about there. We want proposals for extending asset locks. There's a whole lot of limited proposals that ought to be being put forward, particularly by the Co-op Party, outside the Labour Party policy forum. I mean, do what you can, John, within the fora arena, but you will know that what will emerge from those policy forums is a grandiose statement that it's very, very difficult to incorporate in a manifesto. What you need for a manifesto is literally 2 or 3 points which you're going to fight damn hard to get in.
Okay, thank you. Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I was quite interested in your narrative. You identified one of the things that happened 40 years ago and more was the short-lived National Co-op Development Agency. Now, my understanding, I mean, I was alive, but I wasn't involved at the time. My understanding of that era was that a lot of cooperators on the ground thought that they found the national CDA to be very remote from anything that they were doing. And there were enormous amounts of tension between the national CDA, ICOM, local CDAs, and people actually on the ground doing the work. And the Co-op Union were there in the background trying to hoover up some of the NCDA stuff as well. I just wonder, one of the things that really bothered me about the New Economics Foundation report, which seemed to want to recreate a 1980s style national CDA, is that I fear what you would end up with is what they've had in Scotland, which is fantastic for a very narrow bit of the cooperative agenda that suits other people's policy objectives, but is not really a means by which the co-op movement can articulate and implement its own autonomous agenda. And after all, autonomy and independence are really key co-op principles. So I just wondered, you know, you were an insider at the time in a slightly different part of the movement than, say, John was. I'd just be interested in your reflections and those of other people on the call on that particular question.
No, Richard, if I may say first of all, you're absolutely right. I mean, to have an all-embracing, overall, all-powerful co-op development agency nationally is not the answer. You do need some kind of umbrella, but it doesn't need to be a very powerful umbrella. What you need to do is to devolve those functions to consortia of local authority regional delivery agencies. In fact, if you have a look at the input to the manifesto that Joe Fortune from the Co-op Party and John McDonnell's office and herself tried to get into the manifesto last time, what we were suggesting is that, okay, you might need some kind of overall umbrella body, but what you ought to be thinking of is regional consortia, sometimes led by a prominent local authority, by Greater Manchester, by Tyne and Wear, led by some of the devolved administrations that we've now got taking an umbrella view, but essentially giving the powers and giving the funding that was available to some of the people that we've got represented tonight. In other words, giving it to Louise, giving it to Joe, giving it to Phil, giving it to Stir to Action, giving it to those local people on the ground, because that's where the impetus needs to come from. It doesn't come from a national cooperative development agency. If I may say so, it doesn't come very often from Co-ops UK. It comes from the people who know what they're doing on the ground, and that's where the devolution of power needs to take place.
Thank you, Les. Is there anybody else who's got sort of a question, a comment at this point? Hands up, anyone? No. I think from the conversation there, there's a lot to explore, and I think it's interesting to hear not just sort of the past experience that Les has brought, but the more recent experience from people like Louise is really important that we learn from. So unless we've got any sort of bigger conversations now, what we'd quite like to do, and sort of the purpose of this evening, was sort of how do we learn from what's gone on, and how do we sort of move it forward into you know, taking it forward, and what are our next steps. So ideally we'd like to sort of break out into sort of 3 groups, really, to give an opportunity to explore how do we go about getting co-ops back onto the sort of the mainstream political agenda. What is this groundwork that Les has been talking about that we need to start to do, and perhaps what already exists that we can use and aren't using as effectively as we might be able to at the moment. So at this point, I sort of have to hand over to Phil, who is the technical wizard, who is going to pop us into 3 groups. And I think what we will do at the end of it, after about half an hour you've probably got, is that we will come back together as a big group and really sort of ask the groups to come back on the 3 key points that they've come up with in their discussions. And I think we have 3 willing/unwilling volunteers to kind of lead with the discussions within their group. So we've got John Boyle, John Goodman and Richard Bickle, who will help kind of facilitate those conversations. Phil, I think at this point it's over to you.
Yeah, you'll all receive an invite to join a breakout room, and then it's over to you. When you're in the breakout rooms, if you need help, you can ask for help, and I will come along into your breakout room and try and help. But yeah, so, and then when it's time to come back, you'll get a 60-second warning, after 60 seconds, so you'll need to wrap up at that point, and after 60 seconds you'll be returned back into the main room, And so we would like one of you in each group to be prepared to report back on maybe the 3 main points that you discussed in your breakout group. That the person that reports back does not have to be John or Richard by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it might be good if the demographic of the people reporting back was a bit different. So I'm going to press a button now, and you will receive an invite to a breakout room. And in the chat, there is a suggested prompt for discussion. What can we do to get co-ops into the mainstream political agenda? But obviously, you're welcome to, and undoubtedly will, talk about whatever takes your fancy. Right. As the host, I can't actually join. So I shall lurk.
Hello, welcome back, everybody. I hope you've had some interesting discussions. I know the discussion in our group was wide-ranging but very interesting all at the same time. We've got about 20 minutes before we finish, but I'm aware that will pass very quickly. So I guess the first thing to do is to have a little bit of feedback about the discussions that were held in each of the groups. I'm going to ask John Boyle's group, whoever is going to feedback, be it John or be it somebody else. If it's going to be John, I'm going to have to cut him off.
Yes, yeah, I know. So I'm going to be brief. We did have a good discussion. We centered around three particular areas or three particular things. One was, and it is an old chestnut, but it's still relevant, and that is that we just need to improve the way we promote and educate people in general, but specifically political people. Although the talk was mainly around Co-op Party, but we include Labour Party and other people who are interested in politics, so particularly engaging with politics and educating and informing about cooperation. The second point, which I think we all sort of agreed, but was really nice, and that was from Shamsha, is that, you know what, co-ops are really good. We can be very hopeful about this area. We can, you know, stop beating ourselves up, or as I said, let's have another go, and sort of try to, you know, put across the joy and the potential amazingness of co-ops. And the third thing was, and I think a very good point, I have to credit Ian, that perhaps we should try to reconnect with the trade union movement again. I've lived through quite a few attempts at reconnecting with the trade union movement, so let's have another go. Because I think he was quite right, and I think that the point was well made that, you know, that is the third part of the Labour movement, and they are at the moment being quite active with all of the various disputes, and I've no doubt that even if they're all settled, that there will be a creation of quite a lot of active people. As a result, the fallout from that activity will be that there will be people who will want to be more active and do more stuff. So let's re-engage with the trade unions. That's good for me. You're amazed, aren't you?
I am. I was bracing myself. Thank you, John, for your conciseness. John Goodman, are you feeding back, or is somebody else?
Yeah, no, you've got me, I'm afraid. Sorry, I'm just trying to turn my notes into 3 points, and I'll see how well I've done. It was interesting because we had a mixture of veterans and more recent joiners of the co-op movement, and Caroline, who's a returner, I suppose we could say. So that was interesting. 3 points. Networks. We thought that it was really important that there were local and regional networks of co-ops, both to sustain the co-ops, but also to promote co-ops at the grassroots level, because there's a huge ignorance about co-ops out there. The second point was a kind of ambivalence towards government. Yes, it's important to put pressure on political parties and government, but there's also a wariness about the co-op movement becoming too dependent on grants and favours from the government, which can be turned off at an instant. And on the first point, which is how to put pressure on and lobby government, we thought that perhaps local co-ops could be contacting their MPs and councillors, making direct contact with them and telling them about co-ops, and that perhaps there's a role for some organisation, could be a Co-ops West Midlands, could be Co-ops UK, to train up co-ops in how to do that kind of lobbying. And the third point was, there's whatever we do, there is a role for national organisations like Co-ops UK to be using its contacts at the national level and networks to promote the interests of the co-op movement, and perhaps it's not doing enough of that at the moment. But we didn't get to an idea as to how we could encourage them to be more effective on that front.
Thank you, John. I'm going to hand over to Richard because I know he's the only one who wrote anything down in our group.
So we did manage to get it to 3 points, albeit some of them slightly hybrid. So the first one was about being opportunist. So when there are things happening in your area, are there ways that as cooperators, we can plug into them? And we had 2 practical examples. Joe and I from the West Midlands have been involved in basically writing a manifesto for Liam Byrne's Metro Mayoral campaign, which forced the co-op movement in the West Midlands to actually articulate what it wanted, which was actually quite a good discipline. And we had friends in West Yorkshire from Zuma who had engaged with Tracy Brabin on the Fair Work Charter to say, well, actually, you know, we're a worker co-op, we're a big business in your patch, and you can't get fairer work than co-op work. So that was one point. The second point was about the role of Co-ops UK and the role of big retail societies, about knitting the movement together and making sure that we're supporting one another, and that we're actually developing and articulating what we want. And there was a note from friends in Scotland that when the co-op group had its crisis, it effectively pulled out of everything except Manchester and closed the Scottish operation down, closed all the regional offices. Actually, that was when the co-op support infrastructure and the cross-sectoral bodies also started to fall apart. And the third point was to say, well, actually, we've talked a lot about influencing process and policy, but if what we're really thinking about is influencing people, perhaps as cooperators and co-ops, we could be saying to politicians and policymakers, come and spend a day with us, find out what we do, you know, the show and tell kind of experiential learning, which is a different way of getting the message across. So that's our 3 points.
Thank you. And I know for a fact that we smooshed several together there to get them into 3. So well done, Richard, for presenting them as 3. Thank you for that. Thank you, everybody. I hope the conversations were useful. Les, have you got any comments you want to make on the sort of the feedback? I'm just throwing you in at the deep end there.
I've got a thing. Well, first of all, if I may say so, this will sound very patronising. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us. It's usually the case, as I'm sure you are familiar with, Joe and John and others. Sometimes when we go into breakout groups, people tend to disappear, but we've actually maintained pretty well the same numbers as before we went into breakout groups, which is good. So thank you very much for hanging on. The thing that I keep plugging away, and the thing that I keep saying, and I said in the breakout room to which I was attached, it's the networks thing that's important to me. It's something that Louise touched on earlier. You see, what we had when we had Social Enterprise Network Scotland, and okay, it was Scottish government funding, which has now ceased. What we did, we formed a total of 23 networks for social enterprises. About 17 of those were local geographical networks. Some were staffed, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dundee had got full-time staff. Others didn't have full-time staff. We also, alongside all of that, put together what we called some national thematic networks. We had a cultural thematic network. We had a food thematic network. We had a sports thematic network. So if anybody came along to us as Senscott, or if anybody came along to me, what I would say is, well, look, you ought to get in touch with your network. And because the details of the networks were on the Senscott site, we could tell people where to go and who they could liaise with. Underneath all of that, what we put together, if you like, and I don't like using this word, but we put together a vast ecosystem of other people that they could go to. Now, unfortunately, a lot of that has now been dissipated, and whether we can keep a lot of that going now the Scottish government has withdrawn the funding, I don't know. But it's those networks, apart from Phil and apart from the East Midlands thing, and I'm not quite sure to what extent that is still current, but apart from Phil, there's not many other parts of the country that we can say, you know, go and see the equivalent of Phil, or go and see the equivalent of the people that I used to speak to when they asked me about social enterprise in Scotland. That's what I think is lacking now. Okay, for my money, I think Co-ops UK would be far wiser than spending some of its resources creating those networks than getting into employee ownership. And I would like to see a lot more of that happening. I think local authorities like Greater Manchester, for example, which is a combined authority, or Tracy Braben in Leeds, or Ollie Coppard in Sheffield, I think they could contribute to those networks. But that's what we're lacking in the co-op movement.
Thank you, Les. Louise, you get the brownie point for remembering to put your hand up.
It was actually me. We're sharing the same computer. I wanted to say a couple of things before we finish. First of all, thank you very much, Les. I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody here, but that was so interesting and inspiring. And secondly, just if you want to be cheered up and you've got 3 minutes, Louise has posted on the chat a little 3-minute, just under 3 minutes actually, video from the meeting in Glasgow that Les mentioned earlier, which is just people from worker co-ops talking about how good it is to be getting together and what's so wonderful about cooperating. So feel free to share it. It exists and it's there, and you can send it anywhere and post it anywhere.
Thank you.
Cheers,
John,
up.
John, you want to come back?
I just want to repeat what I said in our group, which is when I was at Co-ops UK, I was also head of regions. We had a region in every region. We had a regional co-op organisation. I used to go around to the meetings. They did all sorts of nice things. They did promotion, they did trade fairs, events and all sorts of things to raise the profile. It didn't cost an awful lot of money from Co-ops UK and the group. I'm supporting what everyone's saying about the usefulness and the value for money for those kinds of regional entities, local entities. And perhaps those people who've got any kind of role at Co-ops UK could encourage them to do what Les is suggesting, which is to redirect the resources to nurturing and those kind of networks.
Thank you. Definitely a theme coming through here, isn't there? It's,
Joe, just as a matter of interest, I mean, I think John's quite right. We've got an interesting combination of old timers, that's people who've been doing it for a bit like me, and some brand newcomers like Louise and Karen and some of the others. I mean, is there anything that we haven't touched upon? I think we're all saying a lot of around which we can form some kind of a consensus, but is there anything that anybody thinks that we've missed?
How do you do networks with no money?
Okay. That's where Co-ops UK ought to be using its resources.
Ian, you want to?
Well, it was just slightly acerbic comment that on Saturday there's a regional Midlands region meeting of the Co-op Party, ostensibly about levelling up. I've got extremely low expectations that it will provide anything like the information that Les has just given us. But maybe we could point that out to them, you know. But I mean, I'd encourage people to go. I want to have some interesting conversations. But anyway, there's an event on Saturday in Derby, ostensibly about levelling up.
Okay, we said we'd do all the promotions at the end, so bear with us. Louise, I've got Louise, Phil and Sean. There's a rush just as we're getting towards the end.
You'd asked, it was just in a very quick response to how do you do the networks with no funding? And it's a very good question. I'm a real fan of we should somehow find a way of being able to stand on our own 2 feet. I mean, I've always felt, I mean, one of the reasons when we set up our workers co-op, with this whole discussion about, you know, should we be applying for grant funding and blah, blah, blah. And we came up with the no, we want to be really self-sustaining and somehow, you know, go on being able to stand on our own 2 feet. And I feel the same about the whole networks. I think it's very good, the point that Les raised. I used to go along, I was on the board of Social Enterprise Scotland. So I used to go along to social enterprise networks, the Glasgow meetups, and sometimes to the culture one. and they're fantastic, and they're actually a bit of a kind of model that I've got in my head for what we could do with worker co-ops, or not with worker co-ops, but with co-ops in Scotland. And I've been trying to encourage these sort of meetups, but the template for that is not fully funded like the social enterprise networks, but much more like something else that I do in my working life, which is going along to the digital meetups that we do, where a particular digital company will usually a sort of slightly more well-heeled one, or one that's got kind of decent premises, or sometimes it's just in a pub, but we'll host and organize, self-organize and just invite other people along. And that's what we've started to do in Scotland after the worker co-op gathering. You see a bit on the link that I've posted in the chat that Lucinda mentioned. So we've got the Edinburgh gathering and the Glasgow gathering, and the idea isn't that those are going to be funded gatherings. It's just that, you know, Green City will host you know, whatever get together. Edinburgh Student Housing Co-op hosted what? And the idea that that's just a regular, like a monthly meetup that's very low key, which is all about self-supporting, but it becomes a fixed date in the calendar. So anybody who's co-op curious will find out, oh, well, there's this monthly meeting, I can drop in and find out about it. So that's kind of what I've got a bit in my head at the moment, or that we who doing kind of co-op-y stuff in Scotland are trying to think about. It's not a long-term solution, but it's a kind of grassroots way. And just also, sorry, I'll get off because I've been talking for a long time and other people have got their hands up.
Okay, I've got Phil's got his hand up and Sean's got his hand up, and we've got about 3 minutes. So
okay, just briefly, I'm very grateful to Les and others for pointing out that we have a network in the West Midlands, and also to others for highlighting that people like Co-ops London are still going, and also the cooperative development agencies, such as CASE in the East Midlands. I mean, Cooperatives West Midlands does not have a lot of money. It pays me a very modest amount to keep things ticking over. I think the key to our success is that we're clear about what our purpose is. I think that after Richard described when Co-ops UK withdrew from regional co-op networks, and obviously Wales, somebody has pointed out that Wales has its own co-op network, which David Smith and others keep going. But since the Co-ops UK withdrew and there is not money, I think that it's, yeah, obviously regional cooperative networks have struggled. I think the key for us is our purpose, which is about being a mutual support network for co-ops and cooperators. And that doesn't have to cost a lot of money, because being a solidarity network is fair, it can be fairly low key. And so a lot of this, I mean, 10 years ago, we used to put on showpiece events at Birmingham Council House, sit down lunch, £3,000 budget, beautiful venue. We don't have the money to do that anymore, but low key cooperator to cooperator solidarity is something that doesn't have to cost a lot of money.
And I'm going to abuse my position as chair here and just chip in, is that because we got those networks, we were able to make that contribution to the Liam Byrne manifesto, and I think we were already partly organised there. Sean, you had your hand up. You've taken it down. Do you still want to?
Yeah, I would say something very briefly, but I recognise that I joined late, so maybe it's already been mentioned. But I just thought when Les was saying anything more, there is the Worker Co-op Federation, which is sort of in its infancy, but I think that hopefully that's a place where
Sean,
we can be a bit more creative.
I should have mentioned the Worker Co-ops Federation. I mean, that's one of the secret weapons that I hope we can use.
Yeah. So that was just to say that, really. So nothing long, but watch this space, hopefully.
No, what Sean Willens and the Worker Co-ops Federation are trying to do is good, and I hope that they will expand their activities. So I mean, that's a bit of hope that we've got, I think.
God, John, you've got 30 seconds.
Yes, an idea which has come up before at Co-op Party conferences, came up last week at a Co-op Party webinar, which is non-retail co-ops join the Co-op Party. There's only about 7 of them, members of the Co-op Party. If you're in there, you've got a voice, and you could actually affect what the Co-op Party does.
Thank you. Phil, I'm going to hand over to you to see whether there are any announcements that people haven't already managed to sneak in.
Yeah, there's an announcement from the film co-op, which is in the chats. They're screening From Below about COVID and post-COVID mutual aid. That's on the 9th of March. So if you go onto the Birmingham Cooperative Film Society's Facebook, you'll be able to see where you can get tickets for that. Ian, you had an announcement which I'm trying to find in the chat now.
I sneaked in, but it was not really my announcement. It was just making people aware of this event in Derby.
The co-op party, yeah,
trying to encourage interesting people to go.
Yeah. So yeah, the Midlands Co-op Party have got an event in Derby this Saturday, and I'm sure you can, if you want to go to that, it'll be on the Co-op Party's events page. And I haven't seen any other announcements, but I'm sure you're all very busy with various things anyway.
Thank you for that. Thank you, everybody. In particular, thank you to Les. I think you were entertaining and informative. So 2 out of 2 there. You've definitely ticked all the boxes this evening. And I think it's really kind of provoked some really interesting conversations. So thank you very much, Les, for that.
Well, thank you, Joe, and thank you, Phil, for doing the organising. Thank you very much.
I was then going to turn to my technical expert. Thank you, Phil, for making everything work so well, because they don't always work very well on these things. So thank you, Phil, for putting the work in and making sure this has happened well.
Thank you for sharing.
See you all soon. See you all soon. See you all soon.
Take care. Thank you so much for coming.
See you.
Bye-bye.